Think about the last time you wanted something badly enough that the wanting itself occupied a significant portion of your daily mental life. The promotion, the relationship, the apartment in the right neighborhood, the version of your body you were working toward, the creative project that was going to prove something about who you actually were. You held the image of it clearly, you worked toward it or worried toward it or both, and then at some point it arrived. You got the thing, and there was a moment, sometimes an hour, sometimes a day, sometimes a week, when the satisfaction was real and present and felt the way you had imagined it would. And then it thinned. And then it was simply the new background condition of your life, no longer a source of the feeling you had been pursuing, just another fact about your circumstances. And somewhere, quietly, almost before the first thing had fully settled, the next thing had already begun to form in the space where the wanting used to live. If that sequence is familiar to you, you are not broken. You are not insufficiently grateful or too ambitious or constitutionally incapable of contentment. You are operating inside a model of happiness that is structurally incapable of delivering what it promises. And the problem is not with your execution of the model. The problem is the model itself. Here is the diagnosis, and it is not a comfortable one, but it is an accurate one. The way most people pursue happiness is built on a category error so fundamental that correcting it requires rethinking something most of us absorbed before we were old enough to question it. Happiness, in the model most of us inherited, is a noun, a thing, a state to be achieved and then inhabited, the way you achieve a destination and then live there. The entire grammar of the pursuit. When I have this, I'll be happy. Once this is in place, things will be good. Treats happiness as something that exists ahead of you, waiting to be reached, and that the business of life is the business of closing the distance between where you are and where the happiness is. This grammar feels so natural, so obviously correct that most people never examine it. They only feel its consequences, the treadmill quality of getting what they wanted and needing to want something else, the persistent sense that the real life, the fully satisfying life, is always slightly ahead of the current one, always just requiring one more thing before it properly begins. Michel de Montaigne looked at this structure with the same patient, unsentimental attention he brought to everything, and he named it for what it was. Not a motivational failure, not a psychological weakness, a philosophical mistake made by almost everyone, including, and this honesty is the thing that makes Montaigne worth reading, himself. Montaigne lived in an era that had no shortage of serious frameworks for thinking about happiness. The Stoics offered one, the Epicureans offered another, the Catholic Church in which he was raised offered a third, oriented entirely away from earthly satisfaction toward the infinitely deferred reward of the afterlife. What all of these frameworks shared, Montaigne noticed, was a striking characteristic. The people who subscribed to them most rigorously did not appear, on close inspection, to be any happier than anyone else. They were often more systematic, more consistent, more philosophically coherent. But the lived quality of their days, the actual texture of their experience, seemed to contain no more genuine contentment than the days of people who had never thought carefully about happiness at all. The elaborate architecture of the pursuit had produced elaborate pursuers. It had not produced people who were actually, quietly, sustainably at ease inside their lives. What Montaigne did in response to this observation was unusual enough, in his era, to read as almost scandalous. In a culture that demanded serious men pursue serious things, virtue, legacy, salvation, the improvement of the soul towards some elevated ideal, Montaigne began writing, in careful and unembarrassed detail, about the pleasure he took in ordinary things, a particular meal eaten slowly with people he liked, a conversation that had no purpose beyond the conversation, the specific sensation of sitting in his own chair, in his own library, with no obligation pressing on him from any direction, walking in his garden with nothing to achieve by walking there. He wrote about these things not as guilty pleasures or confessions of weakness, but as philosophical data, as evidence for an argument he was assembling piece by piece about where the actual substance of a good life is located. The argument, stated plainly, was this: the raw material of happiness is already present in the ordinary texture of daily experience, and the reason most people cannot access it is not that their lives are insufficient, but that their attention is almost never actually where their lives are. The chase for the next thing is not running parallel to the life being lived. It is consuming the attention that would otherwise be available to inhabit the life that already exists. The person who eats a meal while mentally composing the email they need to send afterward has not eaten a meal and done some planning. They have done a moderate amount of planning while being physically present at a meal they did not experience. This is not a minor inefficiency. Practiced consistently over decades, it is the slow accumulation of a life that passed through you without ever quite landing. Montaigne had a word for the quality of attention he was proposing as an alternative, and the word is worth knowing because it captures something that English struggles to express cleanly. He called it jouissance, a full, unhurried savoring of present experience, without the diminishment that comes from comparing it to something that might theoretically be better, or measuring it against a standard that exists somewhere ahead of it. Jouissance is not the same as pleasure, though it includes pleasure. It is closer to a kind of completeness of presence, the quality of actually being where you are, doing what you are doing, with enough attention available to let the experience register as real. Montaigne argued that this was a skill, not a personality trait, that it could be developed, practiced, and strengthened, and that most people never develop it because they have been taught, from early in their lives, to treat it as a lesser pursuit than achievement, as the consolation for people who couldn't manage the real work of building something better. Before you conclude that Montaigne was simply arguing for a pleasant life of small satisfactions, it is worth understanding precisely what he was not saying, because the misreading of this argument does almost as much damage as the original problem. The first misreading is hedonism, the idea that if immediate experience is where happiness lives, then the path forward is to maximize pleasurable experience by accumulating more of it faster at higher intensity. This is the error that produces the person who travels constantly but is never quite present in the place they've arrived, who eats at every celebrated restaurant but photographs the food before tasting it, who moves from experience to experience with the same restless forward lean that the happiness chaser brings to achievement. The hedonist has correctly identified that experience is where happiness lives, and then immediately set about pursuing experience in exactly the same grasping way that the achiever pursues goals. The result is the same. The thing being sought keeps relocating just ahead of where you are. More stimulation does not produce more jouissance. It produces a person too overstimulated to experience jouissance at all. The second misreading is its opposite, and it has an older and more respectable philosophical pedigree, the ascetic tradition, the argument that pleasure itself is suspect, that desire is the source of suffering, that the serious person disciplines themselves away from enjoyment in pursuit of virtue or transcendence, has appeared in various forms across nearly every philosophical and religious tradition in history. Montaigne read all of them, took them seriously, and ultimately rejected them on grounds that had less to do with philosophy than with simple honesty. He enjoyed his food, he valued his physical comforts, he found genuine pleasure in conversation, in wine, in the company of people he loved. To pretend otherwise, or to treat these facts about himself as failures to be corrected, would have been, in his view, a refusal to engage honestly with what it actually meant to be a human being living in a body in the world. The ascetic's rejection of pleasure is not a solution to the problem of unhappiness. It is a different form of the same inattention, the decision that what is presently and actually here is not the right thing to be attending to. Montaigne's path ran between these two wrong answers, and it required something that sounds deceptively simple until you try it. The willingness to let what is actually happening be enough to deserve your full attention, not because nothing better exists or nothing more is possible, not because ambition is wrong or improvement is an illusion, but because the present moment, inhabited with genuine completeness, is the only place where any experience, including the experience of working toward something, can actually occur. The person who is always somewhere else in their head is not living a life oriented toward the future. They are living in a future that never arrives, funded by a present they are not spending. This is the honest tension in the argument, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than smoothed over. Stopping the chase for happiness does not mean wanting nothing, or achieving nothing, or retreating from the effort to build a life that is genuinely better than the one you currently have. Montaigne worked hard at his writing until nearly the end of his life. He served as mayor of Bordeaux during a period of extraordinary political and epidemiological crisis, and he served it conscientiously. He revised the essays continuously, never considering them finished. He was not a man who had lowered his ambitions and called the lowering wisdom. He was a man who had learned to be fully present inside his ambitions, to do the work with his whole attention available to it, rather than spending the work half present while the other half was already somewhere else, measuring the gap between current reality and desired outcome. The difference between those two modes of engagement is not visible from the outside. Both involve effort, both produce output, both can result in the same objective achievements. What differs is entirely internal, whether the person doing the work is actually inhabiting the doing of it, or whether they are already somewhere ahead of it, using it as currency toward a satisfaction that will arrive once it's complete. Montaigne's practice, sustained over decades, was the daily, imperfect, renewable choice to be where he was, to let the essay he was writing be the thing that deserved his attention, not the finished book, to let the conversation he was having be the thing that mattered, not the impression it would leave, to let the meal be a meal, the walk be a walk, the day be a day, rather than a series of corridors leading towards somewhere that kept failing to arrive. The happiness you have been chasing is not ahead of you. It never was. It is a quality of attention, available now in whatever is actually happening in your life at this exact moment. That does not mean your life needs no improvement, or that the work of building something better is without value. It means the building itself, done with presence, done with attention, done as something worth inhabiting rather than merely surviving on the way to what comes next, is already the thing you were looking for. Montaigne said his trade was living. He meant it as a serious statement of professional commitment. The most difficult skill available to any person, and the only one that requires nothing to change first. The life is already here. The only question is whether you are.